Hi, this is a patch I call Loop Van Winkle. It's a polyrhythmic loop recorder, is how I'm describing it. But basically, what that means is that you have 4 tracks on this grid here, and you can use this interface to punch in where you want to record. And you can record different sections for different lengths. So, for instance, if you have 2 blocks pressed in succession, it'll record for that 2-block period. But it's polyrhythmic because you can set the endpoint of these little record sequences to different steps. And you do that by just pressing down on the step for about a second. And we see if that step's selected, it'll turn white. And it'll turn white if it's not selected either, but it'll be a little bit less bright. And so you can, for instance, set all the loops to the same length. And I'll just reset everything. The middle stomp switch resets the loops. And when they're all the same length, each of the record sequences the same length, obviously you'll get a repetitive pattern. But when you start messing with the length of the record pattern, you get things that sort of evolve over time. Which I think makes it a lot of fun to play with because you have this sort of exchange between the predictable and the sort of evolving. I mean, it is all predictable because it's polyrhythmic, but, figuring out how many, each of these steps does over so many different counts, it's more interesting to just play along with it. At the bottom, you can set the pitch or speed for each of the loops. They correspond. I didn't label them, but they correspond, left to right is top to bottom. And you can set a reverse chance for each of the loops. So you could have, one loop that always plays forward and one that always plays backward. Or as these are set, they're all sort of somewhere in between, and they make a coin flip each time there's a new loop recorded as to whether it plays forward or backward. So that's just how I like to roll. There's a second page of controls, and these are all sort of enhancers, let's say. So across the top, again, you have pan position for each of the loops, but you can also set it to randomly pan. And if you do that, then the first pan position control sets the maximum width. So right now it's set all the way to the left. If you set it all the way to the right, it's the same thing. It's the absolute width rather than, everything will be panned to the left, everything will be panned to the right. When it's setting the width, well, you'll hear it. If you're hearing this in stereo, I guess. And if I set this for a narrower span, it'll be narrower. We have a tap tempo indicator, but you can also just tap in a tempo there if you're not using a stomp switch. I kind of tried to design this to be as accessible to someone who's loading this into Eurobureau as possible, while still using the stomp switch configurations on ZOIA. So all of the stomp switch controls are reproduced in the buttons here. The first one is tap tempo on the left. This one resets the playback position. Now you'll see that get out of sync pretty quickly because we have some of the sequences set to different lengths. And the third one will cause it to stop recording. So whatever is in its playback buffer at that time will be looped. Which is a nice way to sort of record something and use it as sort of a rhythmic backdrop to what you're doing. There are also two probability controls beyond the reverse probability controls. These ones are global. Density is the probability that a loop will play back after it's been recorded. So each of the loopers is set to play once. They aren't continuously looping. You can probably hear that as I play. And you can basically determine whether a trigger is sent to them to cause them to play back. Which can add another layer of unpredictability into a performance. And refresh rate is essentially the opposite. Not the opposite. Refresh rate is essentially the probability that new material will be recorded into a given loop. So if the refresh rate is set to something very low, they're not refreshing anymore, so they just play back each time they receive a trigger. It's the same mechanism that the play, record, push button works by, actually. But you can set the refresh rate low and sometimes one of the loops will sort of get stuck on a piece for a little while. You can also add a fade. This is added pre-recording. It was sort of an efficient way to do this because I could add the fade to the input of the loopers rather than their output. So I could do it once instead of 4 times. And it'll just, depending on where this is set, it'll create a fade in and out for that loop. We can also introduce feedback. Because the loops aren't continuously like recording and playing back and looped, this is a little bit less obvious than in some other cases where you have looper feedback. wet and dry level, um, which set the wet and dry level. The wet level is a little bit above unity, just because of the way that some loops are playing at some times and some not at the same time. So you may want to adjust that downward. And then there's the guts of the patch, but the other sort of important page to be familiar with is the clock input. It accepts MIDI clock and the stomp switch and the tap clock. But you can set a divider here if you're using some external clock source and want this to play in some synchronicity with it. But yeah, that's the patch. There's some interesting things you can do with it once you start to think through its process. So these buffers, the more of them you string together, you're doing two things. You're recording more time, but you're also delaying the playback of that buffer longer. So they sort of serve two purposes. One is to record longer segments of audio, sure, but the other is to introduce more delay between recording and playback. I particularly like using this patch with something that's sort of pre-recorded and using it as a way to remix things on the fly. But obviously you can use live instruments like I'm using today. It's sort of, easier to demonstrate that. But yeah, this is Loop Van Winkle. It's sort of a whimsical, fun loop recorder thing. And I hope you enjoy it. Thank you.